people the same. Not knowing this place is the darkness falls above. Will we ever see the sun deteriorate away?
You just heard Paradise Lost from the album Lost Paradise from the band Paradise Lost. This is the Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And that was, of course, the eponymous Paradise Lost.
Yes.
Yeah, that gets confusing. I didn't even think about saying those three things in sequence.
It's tongue twister.
And here we are. We are kind of coming sort of full circle back to where this podcast began many, many years ago, back in 2008. We recorded, I looked, I think it was in late May, early June of 2008. It was our 9th episode. Mark and I had decided to choose our top 6 favorite Paradise Lost songs each, because we kind of felt like we had just done a 2-part Enslaved compendium that was exhausting, and so we just...
It was exhausting to listen to with how kind of... their music, and especially
just a
up
lot
to that era,
yeah, it's just a lot going on. So we decided to do something a little bit more lighthearted, and instead of exploring Paradise Lost's entire back catalog, we just kind of picked a few favorites so we could kind of basically talk about Paradise Lost, and we always intended to come back to them. And so here we are, many, many years later, almost 10 years later, about 9 years after it. And I will say this, I think I looked, it's been, unless you count, our comeback episode about a year and a half or so ago with At the Gates and Refuse, that's the last Swedish thing we've done. We've actually been on a pretty good run of not doing Swedish bands.
That used to be the fallback.
Yeah, that used to be episodes. Like our kind of the running joke, that and the appearance of Phoenix the Cat sometimes, was that we couldn't go like 3 episodes without doing Swedish metal of some sort. So, but yeah, here we are with looking at Paradise Lost. We're going to be probably doing a 3-parter is what it's kind of shaping up to be here. And, this is a band that's near and dear, especially I think, Mark, this is probably one of your...
It's like one of my top 3 bands.
Your core bands,
yeah.
They probably to you what... like Anathema or Catatonia is to me, even though you're also a pretty huge Catatonia guy. But I think I discovered Paradise Lost at a kind of a weird time, like right at the end of like their kind of classic era, with Draconian Times.
They were kind of the rise of their powers, yeah.
Yeah, and so, like, their stuff after that was a little bit weird and wasn't always necessarily taken seriously by, like, the metal community, so I kind of came into it at a weirder time and then kind of went backwards and appreciated
I don't know if there's, like, a good time to come into Paradise Lost, because there's no episode... I don't think any two albums really sound exactly the same, especially early on, those first... 4 or 5, it was like jumping a genre every year,
Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of one of the things that makes them, when you look at their legacy and you look at where they are now and all the different sort of movements that they've had in their career, they're one of the more interesting bands to look at as like a kind of a career retrospective, because you can almost... the way we've sort of done is you have this kind of traditional phase, like their early years where they were, leaders in the metal community and the doom death genre, and we'll get into all that stuff. And then you have kind of the experimental, like late teenage, early college years where they're getting out of their skin a little bit and trying some new genres. And then kind of the return to form phase is probably will make up the third episode, is kind of how we have it. And so
we're back to the roots, because
some
people, I don't know, they're a divisive band in the fact that they've jumped genres so many times, I think, too, that people that really liked the first 3 records, first 4 records, probably hate some of the shit that happened in the 2000s just because it was not metal,
the late 90s,
such an imagination. But the one, I think, overarching idea and feeling behind the whole thing is always miserable.
Yep.
They always had that going for them. So they're more... I see them almost more like a film director, where they can jump around to different genres, but they always bring a certain kind of...
But they have an aesthetic or a
auteur
vision.
Kind of
the auteur vision. Yeah,
because you can see, like, no matter what... who am I going to use?
We look at like Kubrick or Scorsese or Hitchcock or somebody.
Because he can jump around to do all different genres, even Hitchcock to some degree.
Yeah.
There's always certain stamps of what their style was, but... just musically, which I don't think happens really that much.
It's pretty rare. I mean, I think that's maybe what holds and binds them together in that weird, they refer to Paradise Lost as kind of the beginning of, the so-called Peaceville 3. And I think you look at all 3 of those bands, Anathema, Bride, and, Paradise Lost, and they've all gone in weird directions, different phases of their careers, but they're the kind of bands too where I think people love them and have such a close connection to them, because at any phase you listen to them, no matter how heavy or not heavy they are, you still know that they're them. If that makes sense. Like, as long as there's this weird undertone of Pink Floydism in Anathema, it's still Anathema. Even if, regardless if it's like the Jeff Buckley-ish version or like the Death Doom version. Same with Bride. There's a romantic gothic overtone that's always
in every Bride
thing. And like you said, there's this miserable kind of. They were the ones that coined the use of gothic, and I think gothic metal, and we'll probably unpack this, maybe not this episode, but maybe when we get to like the middle era where they do get kind of gothy, in the traditional sense, but they meant gothic and a gothic romance and a dark, miserable,
and the literal gothic architecture.
The architecture, and the Goths themselves, who were these sort of barbarians storming the gates of the Roman Empire.
Is it the Visigoths? Is that the same thing?
The Visigoths were an offshoot of the Goth. Yeah, okay. There's different tribes of Goths, and that term Gothic for Gothic architecture was used as a derogatory term. I don't know if you remember that from some of your art history classes, but when like the gargoyle and all the sharp spires and flying buttresses and all that stuff was like kind of showing up in Europe in like the 11th and 12th century, people were offended by it, and they said this was built by like barbarians and savages.
Melodramatic.
And the term stuck, and ever since then, like that term has had these associations of like darkness and black and misery and
romanticism too.
You go to Mary Shelley and Dracula and Gothic literature and poetry and stuff, and so
there's a level of camp as well, as it goes on, as far as like all the Hammer horror stuff. It was very everything was played super straight. But everything was there's really a wink.
And I think
as well.
And I not to say Paradise Lost has been winking at the audience, because I think they play it straight. You know what I mean?
Until you hear interviews.
Yeah, that's
because that was the thing. Is the first record that me and Chris, who was on the last episode, you heard the Dimmu Borgir episode. I believe the first thing that I ever heard, at least, I'm not sure if he heard the other one first, but I remember hearing Gothic.
It was Gothic, and I know this only because I went back and listened to our episode 9, many moons ago, and one of the things you talked about was I had to call up Chris to talk to him about our Paradise Lost history, and you revisit it because you had just gotten off the phone with Chris. And
I totally forgot about that.
You guys both commiserated over the fact that, Gothic was, I think, the first thing. I think he got it at Wyatt Earp. And,
I probably got a dub or something from him because Chris was much more proactive about seeking out stuff. Every once in a while I'd be the discoverer of a band,
Sure.
but a lot of the time it was, I'd get stuff from him, but Gothic just blew us away production wise, everything about it. Well, mysterious, like we didn't know what the fuck the cover is, which turns out it's
a pocket
inside of somebody's pocket and a little bit of Greg's or a little bit of Nick's hair.
Yeah, and I think it's Archer's pocket.
Yeah,
I think
the original drummer, but then went back and checked out Lost Paradise, which aesthetically it has this weird kind of like biomechanical thing on the cover. It looks like
almost
a Nocturnus cover.
Like a comic book cover or something like that, like a DC cover from like the 80s or something.
It's real weird, like one of the weird offshoots, like Marvel Comics presents
Deathstrike the Terminator or something weird like that.
Something super bizarre. And then when Shades of God came out, that was kind of like the first one I think we heard, like when it came out.
Yeah,
like right before it came out. That was the first time we saw them live as well. But
the famous Blondie show.
Yes.
The notorious worst show Paradise Lost ever played. That
was something else. It was Creator, Morbid Angel, and Paradise Lost, and there's probably 8 people there.
Yeah.
But we still had a mosh pit.
Yeah. I'm jealous. I've never seen Morbid or Paradise Lost. I've seemed to miss them every time that they've...
That's the only time I've seen Commando Pete Sandoval.
Commando Pete, yeah.
And he was
no more.
he was impressive. Jesus.
So, when you talk about, like, the aesthetic of what they're sort of doing, I know, Mark, you did a little bit of research into kind of, like, where they kind of came from, because I think so often and this is something, like, as a history person, the context of your background of where you come from and the environment you grow up shapes kind of your viewpoints towards things. And you look at, like, Sabbath coming from, Birmingham.
Same with Priest, like, that kind of mechanical, like, MC5 and, the Detroit
Stooges coming from Detroit,
stuff.
Factory work. Yeah, so Halifax is where they hail from in England, and you kind of looked into a couple things.
This is just like some Wikipedia
just some kind of fun little things. Yeah, fun tidbits.
But they were known for their wool industry in the area, and then I guess they're considered the North, even though they're just slightly north of the Midlands, and they're still a big chunk of.
Yeah, they're kind of part of that, like that northern. There's like a northern clip that's kind of known for the industrial part of, of England, Manchester, Birmingham.
Is Liverpool in that as well?
Liverpool is, yeah. I don't know how industrial Liverpool is. I know it's a port city. I'm sure there's some kind of industry there. But yeah,
all this stuff. Just wanting to. I think the more I listen to stuff, because I'm not going out and trying to find new bands all the time. I'm trying to dig into, like, even with these shows, like, figure out what from like a, socio. I guess
socio-political, socioeconomic,
or just anthropological thing, like why certain bands, gravitated this way. Because also, like, the Cult, I had a list here.
Yeah, and you can hear some Cult in some of the stuff that they
do. From the
you
Bradford, Halifax, Leeds area. Mm-hmm. The Cult came out of there, Sisters of Mercy, New Model Army, My Dying Bride.
Yep.
And there's a quote from Gregor just said it was like it's bleaker up north, or
well, having lived in England,
it's grim up north. And I think probably from a weather standpoint, but also just like a people's outlook on life being in these industrial cities.
I think you even look at like the poppier side of England has like a darker edge to it, whether it's like indie rock stuff like the Smiths or the Cure, there's always like a morose kind of thing. Even the Cult, there's like the Cult have these like AC/DC kind of records like the Electric and Sonic Temple, but you listen to like She Sells Sanctuary and stuff, and there is like this sort of darker, morose undertone built inside of that.
There's always like a stiff upper lip, but like with a melancholic. I don't know if it's like the whole class system thing, because that's like something that I don't understand that from a first-hand perspective, like growing up in that kind of like environment, how that would shape you.
I think too the weather, like I said, I lived in England and student taught there, and it rained every day but 3 days, that we were there. They don't get a lot of snow in the south, but like it just was like cold and miserable, wet, miserable, cold kind of stuff.
I was in Portland for 2 weeks and it rained almost the whole time.
Yeah.
I could see how that could totally screw with you.
Yeah, you get the Seattle bands, and they were kind of coming out of there was a melancholic kind of as Iggy Pop describes it, a sullen quality, You know, and one thing like Iggy kind of talks about in Metal Evolution, I remember, is he kind of talks about like one thing about Stooges and MC5 music because of where they came from is there was a sullen quality to the kind of music they did, and he said you find the same sort of sullen quality, and he mentioned goth bands, grunge bands, and like he mentioned these genres, and you go, oh yeah, there is something kind of like about that it's a little bit more subdued. It's not flashy. There's something about that, and so I think they're kind of coming out of that context a little bit, and but musically, when you start to talk about like what influences, you start to hear, especially in those first two records that we're going to be looking at here first, Lost Paradise and the aforementioned, you mentioned Gothic. I think you have to start with Celtic Frost and like Hellhammer as like the
Trouble.
In Trouble, yeah, the Doom stuff, Candlemass, those are all huge kind of things, but I think because of the slowness of like some of the riffing patterns, I guess I tend to side more with like the Celtic Frost Hellhammer side than maybe the Trouble. Trouble was slow, but like in a different sort of way.
Well, in a lot of, I don't know if it's just being cheeky or not, but in a lot of interviews, they say that Matthew Archer, the original drummer, couldn't play fast, so they're like, we were surrounded by grind bands, so we decided
just to go
play slow.
Opposite, yeah.
But there's.
But I mean, like even like Gregor talks about like being way into like Discharge, and
so that was the thing. The whole right before the grind scene, that whole kind of like crust, which I think is more of a. I don't even know. I think that's like an American version.
Napalm really was a crust band that just evolved into something else because they were more associated with like Conflict and Crass and some of that stuff in the early '80s, and then grindcore just.
But a lot of their like these guys contemporaries were like Concrete Socks and shit like that too, which was just straight up Discharge kind of worship, like super political stuff. So I don't know if it was just like trying to break with tradition because if you look at almost all the lyrics of Paradise Lost, it's all about being mentally unstable or like some kind of like personal trauma or loss. It's all psychological. There's never any like,
it's not super political or
not super political or like or not like these big ideas of like good versus evil or it all seems to be very like centered within the mind or something.
Sure. And when and then when you look at like because we're going to listen to something off of their demos, the Drown in Darkness thing, coming up. But if you look at that era and the Lost Paradise era, you really hear, I mentioned to Mark like Autopsy riffing, Obituary riffing, which is basically Celtic Frost riffing, and stuff like that. But it's
which when you come down to it,
slowed down, death doomy kind of stuff.
Those riffs that you just like Obituary and some Autopsies that's a mix of Black Sabbath and then taking like when anybody picks up a guitar and they go like the Celtic Frost riff, that's what that kind of riffing. It's almost like a primal heavy metal riffing or something. That's like the first thing anybody picks up.
Well, and I wrote down Black Sabbath via Hellhammer.
Yeah,
that's kind of what you hear like in Rotting Misery and Paradise Lost. These songs from their Lost Paradise stuff. You start to hear some of that. Winter is another band that kind of had that same kind of weird, crusty death doom sort of sound in the late '80s, early '90s.
But they were even slower.
Yeah, they were. But again, it's just like there weren't a lot of bands that sounded like what you hear, especially with like Lost Paradise.
Well, there was no, even though it's definitely a death metal record, no other metal guitar player I've ever heard, except for Anders from Catatonia, has ever sounded like Greg McIntosh.
Yeah, he's
the weird. I mean, he's a lead player, but he's not a flashy lead player. He's just like he can, make you feel like you just lost the love of your life with 3 notes.
Yeah,
and just by like hammering it out, like just super simple, a little bit of like Crybaby, wah wah kind of stuff. Sure. But I've never heard anybody arrange stuff like that before.
Well, and I think too, like that song we just started off with, the Paradise Lost, like that solo is one of the more insane solos you hear on that whole first record. It's noisy and abstract and visceral, and that's something I would kind of describe Gregor's style as. It's like
it cuts right to the
it's like knife sharp. Sometimes we'll hear that time and time again. I think of like Daylight Torn when it just comes out of nowhere and just grabs you by the throat, and you're like, whoa. They
almost function as if Nick Holmes and Greg McIntosh are almost dueling back and forth.
Yeah.
That's like a call and response between, which is sometimes common, but not necessarily in metal.
Not necessarily. Blues-based metal, yes, because call and response is.
But Aaron Ady is he's always just, him and Stephen Edmondson are always just kind of the propulsive beat that keep things going.
Eddie's the rhythm guitarist and...
he's the bass guitarist.
Yeah, bass guitarist, yeah.
But he's they like Greg never seems like he's always just it's not a flashy thing. It's just a call and response between those two, and being the primary songwriters, it's kind of interesting. Like he plays almost vocal phrasing for his leads.
Yeah, he's almost like it's kind of like how Peter Green and Hendrix, their approach was, you could, and even Santana to some extent, is you can almost physically hear the vocal lines and them speaking with the guitar sometimes.
It's a very jazz kind of thing.
Except they were speaking in more of a delicate sense often, and Gregor's like screaming.
Yeah,
like there's a torment. Yeah, there's an agony kind of side to some of the things that he's doing. So, and what's so weird about Lost Paradise is this is a record, like, you and I were just both saying that as we get older, we tend to come back to this one a little bit more, partially because we probably exhausted Gothic and Shades of God and Icon and
it sounded a little bit more impenetrable at the time. But it's 25 years out.
It's a mix of weird ideas. Sure. Like some of them work, and some, like, you kind of go, there's a youthful quality to it. Like they're kitchen sinking a lot of stuff. It's almost
just
like,
that naive. I think they mentioned in an interview where we just threw in riff after riff after riff after riff, and it kind of ended when it ended.
Yeah, it's kind of like what you hear with like Red in the Sky sometimes from At the Gates, where you're just like, that's crazy solo, crazy melody, this, that.
It's like young, enthusiastic kids that don't understand like traditional songcraft. Like they don't know that you need to start with this.
They don't know how to edit themselves sometimes.
Or like return to a theme or anything. It's just like, okay, we can play these riffs pretty good together. How's that?
Yeah, and I wrote down a quote from Gregor, the guitar player. He says, "The first album is a first album. You don't know who you are or what you're doing." Yeah, I mean, that it's pretty succinct, and that's kind of what he's sort of capturing there. But, again, like, I think, like a song we're going to listen to in this next set, Roddy Misery off the record, one of the things I wrote about that is, it's definitely like a slowed down kind of death metal riffing, almost like what you hear, like Asphyx does some of those kinds of things, Autopsy to some extent. But there's something that's a little bit different about them than those bands in that there's more of a foreboding atmosphere. It's like a
lot of it has to do with the production,
like a funeral-y kind of feel to it, and that might come from obviously the Candlemass and the Trouble influences and stuff like that. But you're right. I think it's the lack of production almost too.
It's because the guy that did Gothic was pretty stoked on how weird the band was, so he messed, because Gothic has even more crazy production sounds. It's like it's hard to even, like, almost, it doesn't have a phaser sound, but it just sounds like it's like in another dimension, bleak, echoey.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot of.
I've heard people criticize it for its production, and one of the questions I sort of wrote down, like, when we get to that is, like, controversial opinion. It's not mine, but I've heard people say that the only thing they knock Gothic for is the production, and to me, that kind of gives it some of its appeal, is it has kind of an odd production. I wouldn't want that maybe cleaned up like, say, Icon was.
No, I think that's what makes it more unique.
Yeah,
too.
But again, there's this perspective out there I wasn't realizing until I started researching, that there is, like, some people that really don't like the production. They love the songs, and they're like, oh, if only it had been produced better. And that kind of caught me off guard, and I was like, huh, that's weird. I've never heard anybody say that. You talk to, like, Albert Mudrian from Decibel, and he's, he goes gaga over Gothic, and but I've never heard him say, like, I only wish it was produced better. It almost
I think that's got to be young people.
It's got to be weird. It's almost like saying, like, I kind of wish Altars of Madness was a little less, like, out of control. Like, no, the reason that record's great is it's like
they're on the verge of
right off the rails, at all times. And I feel like that's maybe a good metaphor for maybe Gregor's approach to, like, soloing and stuff, is like it's edgy and, like, always, like, razor thin, like, almost about to go off the rails with some of the stuff he does and some of the ideas that they have, and that's one thing, like, when you compare, like, Roddy Misery to, like, Paradise Lost is, like, more, you hear, like, the traditional sort of, like, Gothic doom kind of elements, like, built inside of it. It's almost like the prototypical what's going to become kind of like their type of song. But then, Roddy Misery's more like traditionally like death metal, and then
a lot of
a song you like is Frozen Illusion. I mean, what kind of jumps out to you about that?
I mean, just out of the songwriting of the whole thing is just, it's pretty sparse on, it's not like a flashy riff.
Yeah. But
it all just that dan, dan, jung, jung, dan. I think maybe it's the timing. It's like
it's a little off.
It's just it's not what you would expect for that riff, and it has a really good propulsive quality to it, and just kind of, I don't know, the way the whole record is set up too. it builds really well. It's like builds a world in your head that you can visualize at least for me, really easily. And it was always, it had kind of a creepy, eerie quality. Even the first time I heard it, you're just kind of like, it makes you uneasy.
Yeah. And I think that's maybe why when I was younger, I didn't pull it out as much, because I feel like Gothic and Icon are like easier listens almost.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
It's like something you can just put on in your car, and it's like comfortable, and you can not sing along, but there's like melodic qualities to it. Whereas like this is like, you're right, it's like an uneasy feeling that you get listening to, you know, Lost Paradise stuff. So, you know, and then you look at one of the things we're going to sort of start with in a second here is some of the demos, and we're going to play a live track from the Plains of Desolation, and you can kind of hear where they sort of come out of. I think the weirdest part is like no one else was really doing anything like this. You know, even on like Lost Paradise, there's a song that we don't have time to play called Breeding Fear, and there's female vocals that show up in it. You know, and again, Mark and I were kind of commenting, please, like, you know, shoot us up on, hit us up on Facebook or Twitter or whatever.
Yeah, Celtic Frost.
Celtic Frost, the only band that
only like extreme metal
that was doing something like that.
I don't think Venom ever did anything like that I can think of.
Certainly Bathory didn't at that point, you know. None of the thrash bands or any of the bands that were sort of on the extreme end of that were doing anything. And so, you know, it's an odd thing. Candlemass, no. I don't believe I've ever heard any female vocals. I mean, there's gothic-y tones to stuff.
Yeah, I mean, they're operatic. Yeah. But they're not, it's all Messiah up until that point.
Exactly. So, you know, they're playing with all these really sort of strange ideas. And obviously, I think what most people would sort of say is if you listen to the Drown in Darkness demos and you listen to Lost Paradise, you hear a lot of fantastic ideas that once they get a little bit more refined, the execution of them is gothic. You know, like gothic is what happens when like you learn to edit yourself a little bit more, like, you know, and you can take some of that uneasiness, but now you can stick some melodies on it, and like now you've got like sing along kind of parts almost, even though like Nick Holmes' vocals are still rough. There's like these melodies that you can kind of find within.
Yeah, he mentions trying to scream in pitch.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and that's tough, you know, and so
a lot of that, even like Sisters of Mercy is a band that they've cited as an influence. A lot of it wasn't necessarily songwriting, but the sound, how weird, especially like the Reptile House era and First, Last, and Always. That stuff had a really bizarre. Nothing really sounded like that, but they brought in a lot of female vocals.
That's true
as well.
Yeah, so same with Dead Can Dance was a huge influence for those guys too. Gregor says like Dead Can Dance was probably a bigger influence on them than like Depeche Mode, even though Depeche Mode gets name dropped a lot when you get to like, especially like the later.
I think they're just more well known than anybody else, so that's why they
you don't say, most people don't know who Dead Can Dance are, I guess, except our group of friends, because
if you grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, you know who they are.
Kind of knew.
If you dated any girls, you know.
I was gonna say, it was good for mixtapes and mixed CDs for your girlfriends and stuff, but those are the sort of bands like you think of, because these guys they predate Catatonia, they predate Bride, they predate Anathema, like those bands, Cathedral, Amorphous, any of the bands that had like doomier, gloomier aspects mixed with death metal a little bit.
Dream Death are kind of a contemporary, but they don't sound anything alike.
And again, and Dream Death like was doing, on the other side of the ocean, kind of their own weird thing, with Journey.
Vocally, it was nothing like,
it was like Tom Araya, type stuff, So, I can't fault them for, the demos and Lost Paradise, because they're almost operating in their own bubble, like free to like formulate and create themselves into whatever they want themselves to be, which is cool. You don't hear that very often, like there's very rarely like a band that's almost coming out of like its own unique existence. I mean, Celtic Frost and Into the Pandemonium is probably like the anchor. You can attach some of the ideas from Paradise Lost, but they're not copying Celtic Frost either.
No, not really at all. I mean, like the first couple obituary records, you could tell where where their influences on their sleeve. But I think all the interviews and I've read and watched over the years with the Paradise Lost guys, that they don't never want to sit still. They get bored easy.
Yep.
And I think just all those, all that kind of like hunger for doing different shit, they just constantly like, they don't want if they hear something that, because I remember they're talking about the first after Gothic came out, like bands started to sound like that, like we don't want to do this anymore. It's already been done
different. And we'll get into that, how different Shades of God is from Gothic, compositionally and stuff like that, so So let's get into some music, and then we're going to kind of come out, and we'll talk a lot more about Gothic and Shades of God and stuff. But we're going to start with a demo track from it's a live version of Drown in Darkness from the CD Drown in Darkness, but it actually originally came from the Plains of Desolation demos from 1989. And then we're going to go to Rotting Misery and Frozen Illusion from Lost Paradise from 1990. And we'll end with a song from Gothic and kind of come back and talk about them. But one of the things that we have is a cool treat when you kind of come out of Hearing the Painless, which is the first song from Gothic we're going to hear. And fellow friend of the podcast and metal author and former editor of Metal Maniacs, and he's worked for a lot of record labels, Century Media, Relapse,
Buyer,
yep, different groups. And Jeff Wagner, who we've had on for some episodes. He did Voivod with us and some progressive metal episodes.
He gave us a little bit of Cirith Ungol.
He did, yeah. He gave us a quote for Cirith Ungol and Manila Road.
Yep.
So I reached out to him and said, hey, we're doing some, it'd be cool to hear from you because you're
one of our metal pundits.
Yeah, one of our metal pundits. And so he recorded a nice little tidbit for us that you'll get to hear some of his thoughts and perspectives. And he's very succinct compared to us. We tend to ramble. So enjoy Drown in Darkness, Rotting Misery, Frozen Illusion, and The Painless.
This next one goes to Louis Fellows, wherever he is. You fucking wimp. Die, you fuckers! Fill Driving is an infant. I have tried darkest steps. Sun is above. But no suffering. peaceful tune, entwined on seas of endless bliss. The painless strength is released. The horror passes through. Cast upon our souls the meek shall inherit our fear. Submit now to this curse in a blight for existence.
Paradise Lost really stood out from all the other metal that was happening at the time. I mean, if you heard their earliest stuff, you know, in the late 80s, or were hip to their 1990 debut, they just had this really mysterious aura back then, and their sound was an interesting mesh of all these different things that nobody had really quite put together before. Their early demos predated those of My Dying Bride and Anathema as well by a couple of years, which kind of makes them the leader in that English doom death triumvirate, the so-called Peaceville 3. I'm not saying that they were the best of that lot ultimately, but there's no touching that second album, Gothic, and there's no denying the influence that that band had at that time. Gothic especially, you know, took inspiration from Celtic Frost's Into the Pandemonium, shot it into the 90s Gothic death metal thing, and is what it is. It wasn't quite as eccentric or quite as bonkers as that Frost album, but it did stretch the parameters of doom and death pretty much, you know, further than anyone had up to that point. They pretty quickly cleaned up their sound after that with the relatively more straightforward Shades of God and Icon. But those are super strong albums for what they are, which just proved that they were mastering every step they took, even if they would, you know, kind of continue disgruntling some fans along the way.
You just heard The Painless, before that Frozen Illusion, Rotting Misery, and we started things off with Drown in Darkness, and we hope you enjoyed Jeff Wagner's little tidbits on things. He kind of succinctly summarizes especially kind of the role that Gothic played in sort of kickstarting a lot of this stuff. And I think one thing, you know, as we start to venture into Gothic here in the next couple minutes is, you know, one thing is this is the start of so many careers starts with this record, you know. Catatonia, My Dying Bride, bands like Solstice, Draconian, Theater Tragedy, Lacuna Coil, I mean The Gathering, you know, the list goes on. Swallow the Sun. There's so many bands.
There's a lot of way worse bands too.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad kind of gothy kind of stuff, because one of the things that, you know, we said happened on Lost Paradise on a song like Breeding Fear is the introduction of female vocals, but what you'll hear, especially at the title track that we're going to kind of start off with, is really the first almost completely seamless masterpiece use of female vocals in metal. Not to say I didn't appreciate what Celtic Frost did, but they were kind of like, they're like part of the atmosphere of it, but to me they're not like an essential part of those songs. They're just another cool idea.
And those are some weird songs too. It's just all this disjointed orchestral shit that turns into a song. It's like a weird intro-y kind of thing.
To me, like Gothic, the title track, like when she first comes in, that's like a game-changing moment in the history of metal.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
like you hear this just iconic riff, you know, you know, and it's like, and he's just like gutturally like going for it, and then all of a sudden like it kind of cuts out a little bit clean, and here comes, you know, Sarah Marian's vocals, and you're like, whoa, I've never heard anything like that, you know. And it's weird because, you know, it's hard for me because I heard like, say, Dark Tranquillity and stuff like that before I heard Gothic, because of just the time period I got into metal and stuff, so it wasn't as surprising. But I'm, you know, as a history teacher, I'm able to sort of, I think, put myself into historical context naturally, because I kind of have to set that scene. And so I can imagine what you guys sitting there hearing that for the first time must have been like.
I don't know if I was as bowled over by the female vocals
as the tone of the
whole, just how it made me feel.
Yeah, I was going to say everything. It's a complete package.
Because at least for me, like I probably got into listening to, like, going out and buying music later than most kids did, because I was much more of a, you know, an introvert. I'd rather sit around and read comics or draw and just listen to, like, my mom had classical music at the house. So listen to that, or like if Roy Orbison was on or something, or Beach Boys, whatever, fine. I didn't seek stuff out. I just listened to what was on. It was
just there, kind of, yeah.
And I remember when I first heard even Orbison was one of the first people that I heard, and it made me feel something more than any other. Like,
it's kind of haunting.
Yeah,
really. Yeah.
Like when music makes you physically feel something, and that's what, like, hearing Gothic for the first time, it just, like, you know, you stood in your, or you just stood still in your tracks. It was just crazy.
I mean, I would make an argument that, like, you know, Gothic, the song, is one of the more essential perfect metal songs. There's no critique I can say about that song.
And I mentioned this to you off mic, but how great that Gothic starts the record, and then Left Hand Path from Entombed, Left Hand Path starts it, and that's a flawless, that's like one of the quintessential death metal songs ever.
You just, you hear it, and it's like the entire history of the genre in one song. You know, and I mean, that's what people say, like, about, like, Black Sabbath, you know, Church Bells, Eerie, talking about Satan, start
the
slow,
tritone,
the Devil's Note, the tritone, the diminished fifth, all that sort of stuff, and then the, you know, the chugging fast part kind of at the end. That's the entire history of metal, like, in one song, you know. And so this is the entire history of Gothic kind of doom metal in one song, you know.
It's the template.
Yeah, in Left Hand Path, or, you know, even Override the Overture, you can debate, you know, those are like the templates for, like,
I mean, those two are great, but I still think that Left Hand Path beats it out as far as just compositionally and the Phantasm.
Yeah, the Phantasm stuff is puts it over the edge. But, you know, you get, like, a song we're going to hear after Gothic, like Dead Emotion, and, like, the guitar tone and the leads are like out of this world.
They're bonkers. I mean, like, I don't know what the fuck they put through them. Like, what this was I mentioned briefly. There's the guy that ran Academy Studios that did most of the Peaceville stuff. I think they were mostly just like rock. They would record rock bands.
Yeah, I remember.
But the producer, I don't have his name handy, but he seemed to be interested in what they were doing and would just give them all these different options for, at least for Greg, for guitar tones.
Yeah.
So this cavernous, weird, like, interdimensional sound, whatever the fuck it was, you're just like, there's nothing else I've heard that quite matches that.
And I think one of the unsung heroes of this record is Hammy, because he played the keyboards on it. Supposedly, that's kind of the.
I thought the other guy, the producer, did.
Did he? Okay, I had heard it was like debated.
Because the stuff I read on Hammy was that he just sat there with a joint and some liquor.
And some liquor. So if it is whoever it is, it's almost like the Al Cooper in like a Rolling Stone. Like just playing that organ note, and didn't know what the fuck he was doing and did it, and it just becomes iconic. And like just the way that the keyboards are sort of seamlessly, like, with the female vocals, the guitar tone, everything is just like boom, firing, the whole record.
Yeah, because usually I don't know what reason, but I always had an aversion to keyboards, even though I grew up listening to classical music. But keyboards always seemed cheap because I'd never heard Deep Purple at that point as a kid.
Yeah.
Like,
I was way into Europe, so.
Because I like
Final Countdown was
I like keyboards on their own. I like John Carpenter music, and like 80s synth kind of stuff. I like, but when you integrated guitar with it, and it was trying to be like,
well, keyboards to me were the same thing that like saxophones and rock music were at a certain point, where I automatically assumed I must hate jazz because like I just thought of like Lethal Weapon soundtracks and like.
Or you think it's going to be a sex scene in a movie because the saxophone starts.
Exactly.
And I think the keytar was another contributing aspect to that too. But
it had an 80s sort of quality to it that.
But this, it didn't. I didn't draw attention to it to me, so that's why it's
atmospheric.
Like, it all works
it just
perfect
creates
together.
The background, And one thing you should say, like to me, Dead Emotion, this is the best vocal performance I think from Nick on this record, and one of his best that he ever did with this style of vocals. I think, when he just like screams like "and you're God" or whatever that line is, like it's just like, oh man, like he's hitting it.
And this is before people had that the DVD series The Zen of Screaming, where you're blowing out your vocal cords and you can't, no matter any contemporary stuff, Necrophagist, any of that's like with super guttural vocals, this still kind of trumps all that shit because they were destroying their throat to do this.
Yeah, and he had the
nodules
and stuff like that. His eyes would be popping out of his head and stuff doing this.
I don't want to have throat cancer like George Michael did.
Yeah. So this is definitely something to appreciate about when you hear the intensity of Nick Holmes' vocals on here. Also, the last album that they recorded in the B tuning, I did notice that. That's kind of a thing. It's again, like you said, they're evolving every record. They're not going to stick to kind of like one thing here.
Yeah. Except for the chug riff.
That's true. That's iconic.
And all the way to Host.
And the unconventional soloing. I mean, that's kind of like a part of them, here. But, besides Gothic and Dead Emotion, we did play The Painless. That was a song you kind of picked out. What jumps out to you about that song? Anything in particular unique or just kind of a quintessential Gothic song?
It's plotting. I think it has a really good vocal performance, like lots of held out scream, growl type stuff. It's the name of their fan club.
Yeah, there you go. The
Painless.
Yeah.
And it's just, the lyrics, this is one that, like, I'm usually not a lyric person. I don't really, unless they jump out as being bad, or if there's something really terrible about it, I don't really, that's not what I go to. It's more the visceral kind of feeling. But I've always loved Holmes' vocals, or Holmes' lyrics.
His lyrics. Mm-hmm.
I've always been drawn, just the imagery that all the stuff kind of conjures has always been super interesting to me.
And I mean, there's so many different songs we could have played. I mean, I think Eternal was kind of considered like the first kind of single almost, from this. It was like Hammy talks about it like in interviews that like they tried to like push that out as like kind of the hit song, even though there's not really a hit song from this record.
It's weird thinking about death metal in like a marketing aspect,
exactly.
Especially back then, because we didn't. No, there's no EPs up until up until after this.
Death metal singles, and stuff like that.
Like Europe maybe, but the stuff we saw was just expensive import CDs.
Yeah,
so there was never. Maybe that's why I came to like death metal. I always listen to the whole record. It's not like songs, so it's always hard for me to pull out.
And I have
specific songs.
Mark and I have talked about this before because of like doing DJ type stuff. Like I have like a singles.
You got a radar on it.
I kind of know, like, oh, this should be maybe the hit song or something. And sometimes, not as much anymore, but like back in the day, like in college and stuff, I think I thought in those terms.
Or like this really sums up what they're trying to accomplish on this record in one song.
Yeah, tough. That's tough, because I don't always have as much, Mark gets to work in the studio and kind of have time to like listen to full albums, and I have to be a little bit more selective sometimes with,
zoning
in on different things and stuff like that.
Just, in preparation for this, I just queued up my iTunes and let it go.
Just let it go. Yeah.
Yeah. Like the BBC sessions, every random version of
which is cool.
550 Paradise Lost songs I have in there.
That's pretty impressive. I don't know how.
I'm sure some of them are duplicates.
Yeah.
Because I had to skip a couple things, but.
And then another song that we're going to highlight though off of Gothic is an instrumental called Angel Tears. And the reason kind of I pulled this out is what's kind of interesting about it is you can almost hear the beginning of like Amorphous' career, at least with like Tales of a Thousand Lakes and some of the tone, that weird tone that you hear with like Finnish metal, where it's like warm. There's something like warm and analog-y kind of about some of...
There's that, then with like the Eastern scales.
And then when you add the Middle Eastern scales in for Amorphous sometimes too. But I guess more like that's... I think of that as like, elegy a little bit more than I do maybe Tales from a Thousand Lakes, but there's definitely the Middle Eastern stuff like Castaway and things like that. But
even like Carillion Isthmus had that weird...
that's true.
That weird warmth, like them and Zisma and Demolich, they all had, I don't know what it was about the recordings, or maybe it was a tuning thing, but they all had that really convulse.
Yeah.
Same kind of thing.
Sure.
It's weird because it's a very Finnish.
It's like almost like a 60s psychedelic like quality, like just built like naturally sort of in. Maybe there's a lot of hippies in Finland from the 60s that just they had kids that started bands or something.
It's weird. There's not a whole and I don't know enough about the Finnish scene to know like what the big studio was either. Because I'm pretty sure that Carillion Isthmus was recorded at Sunlight.
Yeah, it was Skagsberg.
So how does that account for the sound too? Yeah. It's like, I don't know, that's something for another show.
Shaped in a weird way, but yeah. So Angel Tears, when you hear that, like, and there's also some just like emotive soloing. It's not as like out of control as some of the other Macintosh stuff that cuts through. It's more like just. You can just feel it. He's just kind of like talking from the heart with that, and Angel Tears, it evokes, such a cool imagery and stuff like that. And so we're going to kind of, bust through a nice little set there of Gothic, and then we're going to kind of come out with a song from Shades of God that's pretty representative of that record, and that's such an interesting record, and that's Daylight Torn. And we'll talk, we'll kind of finish the show up by talking a little bit about Shades of God there. So we're going to open with the eponymous Gothic from Gothic, Dead Emotion, Angel Tears, and then end with Daylight Torn from Shades of God.
massive to this day. Create
that was Daylight Torn from Shades of God, Angel Tears, Dead Emotion, and we kickstarted things with Gothic. And quite a solo there, quite a middle
quite
sequence.
A build to the whole song, really.
Yeah, it's really just a big like cum scene is what that is. You know, it's a big porn, metal porn.
Well, we don't always do this, but as we were we will listen to the song again and did some more commentary on the thing, but the whole that clean picking classical guitar kind of style, they don't really ever revisit that very much that I can remember. It's a very, kind of like
very
Metallica.
Much this album. Yeah. In the precursor, we were trying to debate on who did it, if it was like a new wave of British heavy metal band or Metallica that did it. And I mean, really, Metallica did it probably the best.
Yeah, they're the ones that I think are known, maybe at least in the anything post thrash. Mm-hmm. That era on, I think is.
So if you know of a band that's kind of kickstarted that we're kind of like forgetting, hit us up because
especially that's like a pretty like heavy band, not like Priest or Deep Purple or something,
exactly.
but somebody that really did that class. I'm sure Yngwie Malmsteen might have done something like that, but I don't really consider that in the same canon as this kind of stuff.
And Shades of God's a weird record in that it's pretty dense in terms of some of the stuff that they're compositionally doing. I was trying to draw a comparison with like a Injustice for All or something where like there's a lot going on in the songs. There tend to be it's the longest songs they ever do in their career. A lot of 7 minutes,
a lot of chug.
Yep,
through the whole thing.
I could see how some people might find this record like upon like maybe only a couple listens a little bit more impenetrable. Like you got to like focus. And you said it was a big headphone record for you. Well, because you had it on Discman and
it was
things
the first CD I ever bought post tape.
Yeah,
and then had a Discman, so I didn't have any choice.
But that probably allowed you to break it down and really notice all the like different things that are kind of happening and the different sequences and movements. Daylight Torn. I mean, that song's 8 minutes long. That's like My Dying Bride type stuff.
It doesn't seem. They don't really have a whole lot of songs that build like that.
Exactly.
I mean, there's a couple like on Icon and on Draconian. They have a little bit of that with the toms kind of building up and that kind of stuff. But this was like. This kind of shows all those other ones up.
Now, did you, you hear a song like Daylight Torn, and it's just, obviously it seems like it's just taking some of the lessons from Gothic and just kind of making it more complex and moving in that direction.
It seems angrier to me.
It's very visceral, angrier. Holmes' vocals are a little less refined. He's like trying to like.
This is the screaming through pitch. Mm-hmm. Where he's talked about, I think.
Yep, and that solo. I said to Mark that when you come out of that clean part and the drums are sort of building and then like he screams and then that screeching like just that's my favorite 5 seconds maybe in any Paradise Lost song right there. Like it just I get giddy every time I know it's about to happen.
That song really showcases almost every thing that's really dynamic about the band.
Absolutely.
Too.
And
singing.
Yep. Did you guys get a sense that they were maybe gonna move out of this? Because, I mean, where we're going with the next episode, maybe this is a better question to debate on part 2 a little bit. But I guess as we're kind of leaving behind this era, because Shades of God is kind of a line in the sand for a lot of people. Not that Icon's like a pop album or anything that we're going to get to next, but, did you and Chris, when you're kind of rocking out to this, did you see like the future where maybe they might be heading progressively?
I don't think we were thinking about it at all.
I'm just curious if there were hints or anything like that.
I think everything we noticed, as a surface level as a teenager, was just the production was getting better.
Yeah,
I mean, it was getting traditionally better. Like this sounded more like a thrash record was produced than say Gothic or Lost Paradise or something. So I think that's the stuff we were noticing. Chris might have had other ideas, but not that we shared together. But I was just stoked. We were so. It was just like being inundated by tons of naked women, and you're just like, oh my, this is so great, this is so great, this one's great, this one's great.
This is awesome.
Like I don't know how much we actually thought about a lot of these records, and because then Carcass came, and then we
I was going to say everything was kind of happening.
Yeah,
And speaking of Carcass, I said, man, there's something kind of cool about this riff, and you go, it's a Carcass riff. I said, yeah, that's what it is. The that kind of whatever the hell that.
I mean, they do it on. The Black Star,
and all that sort of stuff.
They use it. That's a Bill Steer kind of staple.
Now, what about because we're going to end with "As I Die," and you can almost say "As I Die" is like the first single.
It was their first hit,
kind of the first hit. Were you guys like, cool? This is like catchy, or did it again? I'm trying to approach it without saying was there a warning sign that like, oh, this is a little too cleaned up, it's a little too melodic, it's a little too catchy, or were you like, cool?
No, this was the first instance because they have the As I Die EP, and that automatically kind of like zeroes in on like, oh, this must be more of an important song.
Yeah.
It's like, I got the Madonna single for whatever, I can't even think of it at this point, but
Lucky Star.
Yeah, like this is the one that I think is supposed to be good, but then there's usually something more interesting on the B-sides to a lot of these singles.
And one song, if we had more time, that we would have loved to have played is the Atomic Rooster cover.
Death Walks Behind You is great.
Very cool.
But I think As I Die is a super important bridge song between these two eras, these two
episodes. It's the sneak preview of Icon.
Yeah.
Really. Where they're sort of going.
And even up into their, God, I think they might have stopped playing it after the 1 second cycle for a while. But that was a staple consistently every
episode. Every time you saw Death, they had to like end with Pull the Plug.
Yep.
It's just like that song.
Or Zombie Ritual or something.
Exactly. Yeah, and this is one of the first songs that grabbed my attention when I went back to these older records once I started going backwards from Draconian and stuff.
It's got a more traditional songwriting sense to how everything's arranged. And
it's shorter, it's succinct, 3 minutes and 45 seconds, when a lot of the other songs, like I said on the record, are 5, 6, 7 minutes long.
Sure.
But Shades of God, like I said, I think this is a record that I get more value out of it as I get older, because I think there's a lot to be discovered on it, because there are more compositionally complex things happening. They're not as immediate sometimes. They're kind of buried. Like, whereas like when you get to like Icon and Draconian, you kind of get what you get because they're just like really straightforward songs. Like, whereas this, it's like, oh, there's like a labyrinthian quality to some of the stuff that they're doing. Like what you heard on Daylight Torn. But any other thoughts on Shades of God before we sort of send things off about this, this kind of heavier era of Paradise Lost?
This is kind of the first, like from a art standpoint, Dave McKean is doing the cover.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Which that was the one of the first things. Was like, oh, I've seen Dave McKean do other stuff for it was pre-Sandman, I think.
Was it 93? I think Sandman stuff was going because I was
there.
Yeah, that was like.
But I knew him from comics, the comics world. He was in I see him in like anthology things. And
Arkham Asylum had come out at this point, I think.
Did it?
Yeah, that was like 89 or 90.
Okay. Yeah, because I was aware of his stuff. I was like, oh, that's a cool kind of crossover thing. And then it was a really interesting look.
Yeah, the collage kind of.
There's a weird collage with this weird, like, I don't know if it's supposed to be like a lion with its hand coming up, but it's all very abstract looking. And then have the whole like Milton Rotten Apple thing in the back, and they have even the logo on the back where they kind of introduce that little icon of the Rotten Apple, which I always think is neat to be able to tie things like that together.
Milton's Paradise Lost, obviously the illusion for the like one person out there hearing this that doesn't know that's connected
just looking
to
up
the band, and stuff, the fall of grace of mankind and all that sort of stuff with the apple.
Being kicked out of Eden.
Devil's the hero in that story a little bit.
Really?
He's the rebel.
The woman's the temptress.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, the snake is.
That's true. That's true.
If you really think about it, but
I know. But I think it's better in a patriarchal society to blame women for all of man's sin.
Of course. I mean, it's worked this long. Why not keep it going?
Keep it going. But so we're going to kind of head out with this sort of sneak preview of where Paradise Lost is going. So maybe you're new to Paradise Lost, which is cool. Like I kind of told Mark, I said, I know we're kind of sick of some of these songs. I mean, we've heard Gothic a million times, he and I, but I said, I guess for the uninitiated, maybe they need to hear some of the essential songs, the As I Dies and Gothics and things like that, because
especially as we're going on to these other episodes, because they're unidentifiable as the same band, really.
Yeah.
By the time we get 5 years down the road.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, things are going to progress very quickly because Shades of God is 92, and by the time we get to 93, Icon, 95, Draconian. I mean, it's you can't even see some of the traces that go back to Lost Paradise almost by the time you get to songs like Once Solemn or something.
Yeah.
So. But hit us up. Let us know what you thought. Give us some feedback on Facebook. Mark and Jason on Facebook, on Twitter. You can follow us at Podcast Requiem. I'm trying to get those social media platforms going a lot bigger. Leave us a rating on iTunes. We always appreciate that.
Yeah, nothing but good stuff on there.
Questions, requests. So we're going to try and get some Patreon stuff going soon. I know it sounds like a broken record, but this is something I'm going to get on like in the next couple weeks here, and maybe by the time this episode actually hits the air, we'll have some Patreon that can be promoted alongside of it and stuff.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So, and then obviously stick around because soon you'll be hearing part 2 where we get a little bit weirder with Paradise Lost indeed. So enjoy As I Die from Shades of God. I'm Jason.
And I'm Mark. And if you know who Louis Fellows is, tell him he's a fucking wimp.
He's a fucking wimp.